Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Political State Podcast from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's podcast studio in our downtown newsroom. Joining me is the Oklahoman's state capitol reporter, Carmen Foreman. Carmen, hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, a big week for you, the end of a session. We've got a budget signed, it feels like the end of school. It actually is the end of school. A lot of schools are getting out today, and so is the legislature.
Yeah, hooray to both.
Yeah, well, we're going to dive into that a little bit later in today's episode. But in this first segment, we're going to kind of discuss some of the political dynamics of abortion, as a handful of states have pushed laws recently that effectively ban abortion in an effort to get this newly conservative U.S. Supreme Court to possibly take up the issue. And maybe surprisingly, Oklahoma, didn't join in on the group this year, and we'll maybe discuss that a little bit later. But let me introduce our guest for this week's episode, which is Michelle Oberman, who's a professor at Santa Clara University School of Law and the author of a book, Her Body, Our Laws, published last year, that explores kind of the political abortion wars, but it includes a chapter with some great detail on Oklahoma. And Michelle, so happy to have you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to obviously talk a lot about the Oklahoma dynamics of this book, a book that I've read and Carmen has. We've got a copy here in front of us, and just some really interesting insight into the political abortion wars as a whole. And like I said, we want to drill into what you wrote about Oklahoma, but can you first off just give us a little bit of a synopsis of your book and kind of why you decided to tackle this project?
Sure. Yeah. So around 10 years ago, I happened to be in Latin America, first in Chile, which is a country that had a complete ban on abortion. And I was struck by a couple of things that were different from what I'd expected. The first thing was that in spite of the ban, abortion seemed to be really commonplace. It was happening all over. And the second thing was that the laws weren't really being enforced. And so I was curious about that, and I found myself coming back to the States and then deciding that I wanted to go to El Salvador, which has a similar ban to Chile's, one of the strictest bans in the world, and just try to understand what happens today rather than the set point of prior to Roe versus Wade. But what happens today when you ban abortion? So I spent a 10-year period going back and forth to El Salvador studying the answer to that. And I came away feeling like Americans, when they fight over abortion, which is in some ways kind of all we've been doing for the past 50 years, have no real clue to what the answer is. And it's really different from what both sides think. I mean, I think both sides have got it wrong. Women aren't using coat hangers. They're not dying from illegal abortions. They're using drugs they order online. And the laws are almost impossible to enforce. So for folks who really oppose abortion at a moral level, they're going to have to do a lot more than change the law if they want abortion to go away. So then, like, once I started feeling like that, then I really wanted to go spend time in a state that was very pro-life, a state that had dedicated itself to restricting abortion and to doing as much as they could to overturn Roe v. Wade or push back on legalized abortion. And so I was drawn to Oklahoma and got to spend a lot of time there in 2013, 2014 with the help of folks at Oklahoma City Law School, interviewing activists and lawmakers and docs and people that had been really working hard to change laws around abortion, trying to understand what they thought would change if they were successful.
Yeah. Well, real fascinating to read it, if for no other reason than just the kind of insight in some of the major players on the culture war that is abortion here in Oklahoma. I want to ask you about this. This is a part of, you've got a chapter, and there's a subchapter titled Lessons from Longer, which it refers to Tony Longer, who's a major figure in the quote-unquote pro-life movement here. But here's a segment from your book, and you write, one of the questions I asked everyone was what they thought would happen in Oklahoma if Roe v. Wade fell. Ryan Kiesel, who had served 10 years in office fighting for reproductive rights, had a cynical response. And here's what he said in your book. The right doesn't want to win. They don't want Roe v. Wade to fall. Opposing Roe is their template for running for office. It's their political touchstone. It avoids the need to talk about anything else. If that's taken away from them, they're going to have to deal with splits in the coalition, end quote. Now, I think there are some, very dedicated, those who have called themselves pro-life individuals who would probably push back on that and say the cynical response is that no, they want a complete ban. But in the political arena, how true do you think that really is in a state that's, very conservative politically, Republican majorities who most all say that they are pro-life or would describe themselves as pro-life? How true do you think it is that some of them actually wouldn't want to see a complete ban?
So I think it would get complicated. I don't know that it's actually true they wouldn't want to see a ban, but they might not like what they get. And you get to see just a glimpse of that in looking at the response to Alabama's ban that was passed last week, I guess it was, where you had leaders, pro-life leaders like Pat Robertson, and states that are dominant red states, and prosecutors in those states like Georgia or Utah saying, whoa, we don't want to prosecute women. And Alabama's law, to be fair, actually exempts women from prosecution. But it's questions around prosecution that I think are going to partly surface those fracture lines among pro-life people, because frankly, illegal abortion in 2019 doesn't involve doctors. It's abortion drugs. So if you're going to pass these bans and enforce the laws, you're going to have to find someone besides the doctor to go after, because women are ordering drugs online. Self-managed abortion is the dominant way that women are ending unwanted pregnancies in countries with restrictive laws throughout the world. So if you're not going to come after women, then how are you planning to enforce these laws?
Yeah. We have a new governor here in Oklahoma who has said that he'll sign any anti-abortion legislation that comes across his desk, and there was an effort this year for a bill that would reclassify abortion as murder. It didn't make it out of the Senate. We can talk about that here in a moment. But it was interesting because it did. Essentially the woman would be accused of committing murder if she committed or she performed an abortion or had an abortion performed. And those around the governor's office were like, man, we really, privately we're saying we really don't want this to come up, because this, at a time when we're trying to reduce incarceration rates, especially, leading the nation and female incarceration like we do in Oklahoma, it just kind of clashes with that mentality. Now we have this bill. So it just kind of, I guess it does, like you said, kind of opens up a new can of worms. If you're going to put forward a complete ban, it's a little bit more complicated than it might sound.
Right. Right. And let me be clear about this. 60% of women who have abortions already have children. So a plan to lock women up for abortions, even if you assume that juries are going to be willing to convict women, when you look at these cases, historically, juries have not been willing to convict women. I mean, abortion is commonplace. Women have abortions when they can't afford to have children, and there's blood on more than one set of hands by definition in any kind of abortion prosecution. But even if juries were willing to convict, you'd be orphaning children.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just economically and morally, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So are we seeing right now with these states that are, like you said, Alabama, I mean, is this just purely with a newly conservative Supreme Court or a more conservative Supreme Court, is this just an effort to get, the Roe v. Wade debate back in front of the court?
I don't know the answer to it. And I think folks like you who think about politics might be able to give a more sophisticated response. My sense is that for a lot of us on all sides of the abortion war, the law has a really important symbolic value. And we haven't been asked to think beyond symbolism for the past 45 years that we've been fighting over it. And so the symbolic value of a ban, I think, means a lot to folks who hate abortion. So I wouldn't say it's just a cynical attempt to get it in front of Roe, although it may be get it in front of the Supreme Court, although it may be that as well. It's also because we've only been thinking about abortion in symbolic terms. We haven't actually asked practical questions like, how would a rape exception work? Would she have to go to police? Would it have to be a rape by a stranger? What are we going to do with a rape by right? Like these practical questions just haven't been relevant. And we haven't asked our lawmakers those practical questions. So we're going to have to start doing that.
I'm curious, I don't know how much you've kept up with, Oklahoma politics since your book has been published. But, I'm kind of curious. In the book, you said you came to Oklahoma because it is one of the most, quote unquote, pro-life or anti-abortion states in the country. Do you still feel that way, or have states like Alabama taken that position now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of states vying for that title right now, and to be clear, they were vying for it in 2013 when I came as well. The at any given time, the number of states whose elected officials are there by virtue of having courted the vote of pro-life populations or constituencies seems to be pretty high and growing. And so yeah, I know Oklahoma was really proud of the way that it had enacted the model legislation drafted by the National Right to Life movement, and had effectively and quickly moved it through, particularly in the years after term limits took hold. But my sense is that even then there was competition for that title.
How much did you feel like religion played a part in what you saw here in Oklahoma? Because I mean, it's kind of hard to separate in a very conservative state, a very evangelical state, statewide, and maybe it changes a little bit when you're in the urban setting like we are, but a lot of politics and evangelical faith, blend here. And how much did you see that when you were on the ground looking at this issue?
I think religion played a role at a couple of levels. First, just politically, I think that the religious communities, and in particular the Southern Baptist Convention, had organized themselves so that they were mobilized and able to bring out voters on issues, and abortion was an issue they wanted to bring their voters out on. So, literally with a phone call, Dr. Anthony Jordan, who I interviewed, who's the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, could mobilize voters across the state to come out to vote for or against a candidate. But I think religion also plays a role for the folks who are working in the trenches. And my most meaningful and moving interview, I think, was with the women who volunteered at a place called Willow Pregnancy Support on the south side of Oklahoma City, who were, for the most part, Catholic women who had been working to give women alternatives to abortion since 1973. I mean, they started with folding chairs and rented space and a single phone line, and just a teeny bit of support from an international group called Birthright. And over time, they fundraised, built a shelter that can only house 5 women at a time. But when poor women come to them and say, I really wish I could keep this pregnancy, but I'm homeless, I'm addicted to drugs, I've got 2 kids in the foster care system, I don't have a job, I didn't finish high school, I've got all kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder from my boyfriend who beat me, and by the way, I'm 5 months pregnant or 4 months pregnant. They were finding ways to house those women. They're motivated by their religious belief. And it was just a very moving thing to see where their faith took them, and how expensive it is when you're serious about creating alternatives to abortion.
I think what's interesting this year is we talk about some of these states like Alabama and Missouri that seem to be kind of trying to push the envelope on what is legally available in terms of fighting back against abortion. And these laws that seem to be unconstitutional, I think some of the lawmakers would say, well, yeah, that's fine. We're willing to have that battle at the Supreme Court if it comes to that. We didn't see that here in Oklahoma. Oklahoma would seem to be one of those states that would want to get in on this, party, so to speak. What we did see is we saw, a minority group in the Republican Party in the Senate this year that were pushing for this bill that would reclassify abortion as a homicide. The Senate leader declined to take it up. The committee leader also, following his direction, declined to take it up, saying that this would be unconstitutional, and they didn't want to pass legislation that was going to end up, getting bogged down in the courts. Now, someone who's covered politics in Oklahoma for several years, that's an interesting response, because the legislature in the past has had no pause at all about taking up laws or bills that they know are going to be challenged. Now, to be fair, there was a new pro tem for the Senate, so you can't necessarily peg that all on him. He said, "Listen, I'm very pro-life, but I don't want this to be challenged." Is that how would you? Is that? Like I said, I know you're not necessarily an expert in Oklahoma politics, but given your experience in researching the issue here, how much of a debate is that within mostly the Republican Party right now about how far do you go within the bounds of the Constitution versus no, you should try to blow it up and try to get this issue to the Supreme Court?
I think it's a real live debate, and I don't know what was going on in Oklahoma. But I think there is reason to believe that some folks who are really motivated to get rid of Roe versus Wade understand that there is going to be a backlash if you push a really extreme law, that there's never been a majority of Americans who, for example, favor banning abortion in cases of rape and incest.
Yeah.
And so if you push through these bans, you give fodder to pro-choice people to say, look, these guys are going to force pregnancies on women who've been raped. And that's not a popular position. So I imagine that there's folks at the leadership level of the Right to Life movement who are very carefully thinking about messaging and strategy if you want the court to reverse Roe and you want the public to accept any kind of criminalization of abortion.
How much do you, for both you, Michelle, and Carmen can answer this question too. I mean, how much do you think that the 2020 elections are playing a part of this debate? Because I've seen reporting that the National Republican Party is not necessarily too excited about these Alabama laws because they're trying to win back female voters, particularly in kind of suburban areas. Saying that you want a complete ban on abortion may play well here in western Oklahoma. It may not play well in the 5th District, which is our congressional district that includes Oklahoma City and its suburbs, which flipped to the Democrats this year. I mean, how much do you think the 2020 election and that kind of national push to try to win back, female suburban, moderate voters is going to play a part in how far we go with this anti-abortion push?
Carmen, I'm inclined to hear what you have to say. I'm just curious.
I guess I would lean toward it plays a huge part. I mean, I don't know that, what Alabama did on the Alabama level is going to I guess what I would say is that it will all play into the presidential election, certainly, because anytime this abortion debate comes up, then, Trump can talk to his base and say, look at these Supreme Court justices that I've appointed who are against abortion. And if you keep me on for another 4 years, I might get to appoint more. The Democrats, similarly, on the other side, can talk to their base on the other side of the issue. And then, Alabama, I think it plays to the Republicans' home base there. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think maybe part of the reason why Oklahoma is not having as much contentious abortion debate this year is because it is an off-election year, and so I could see more happening in the legislature next year.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious, Michelle, from your reporting in this book that that's a big issue on the doorsteps. I talked to a lot of House and Senate members who are running for office, and they are asked about abortion issues. They're asked about Washington. They're asked about a lot of issues that really don't have a lot of relevancy at the state level. But this is a big issue, and a lot of Republican members ran last year on a quote unquote pro-life platform. Yet we didn't see a lot of push this year when push came to shove during the session. And Carmen's a great point. It's not an election year this year.
Right.
Yeah, and there's not much more push to be had. I mean, you guys have already pushed it, really, really far. You've enacted just about every piece of model legislation drafted by the National Right to Life. So, you're out there. You're really close to being as red as you can be, or as pro-life as you can be. It's just that in the present climate, the sort of the temptation to reach for these symbolic bans seems to have caught the imagination of a bunch of other states. But I wouldn't be surprised at all to see a new raft of laws come through your state legislature in the coming year, just because that's how we think. We think symbolically about abortion. So it's a way that you can nod to your constituents and check a box without having to do anything, without having to spend any money. You've just showed yourself to be pro-life. It's all going to get a lot more interesting, I think, when we ask, okay, do you really just want to do this at a symbolic level, or do you want to actually give women alternatives to having abortions? And just let me be clear for a minute why I say that. Half of all abortions in this country go to women below the poverty line. 75% go to women within 200% of the poverty line. It really is at some very important level about not being able to afford to have a child.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just, we haven't thought of it that way. But if you talk to folks who are coming into abortion clinics, they're often telling you, I just couldn't afford to have another baby.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to, Carmen, real quick, I don't want to necessarily cast this as just, and I don't, and you definitely aren't. In fact, your book doesn't do this. I mean, cast that all Republicans are just after the symbolic part of this fight. Because I mean, you talked to Chris Steele, the former Speaker of the House, who had some really good insight into just kind of what it looks like behind the scenes. And I think he said, listen, you just call a bill pro-life, it's going to get passed. But he said one of his biggest regrets, besides a bill that he voted for, was just that we don't do enough to kind of offer those alternatives and offer that support system. And just like the group of, the religious group that, has been working since the 70s in that realm. So there are some groups that are really trying to do that.
And in the Oklahoma legislature, I mean, in their budget this year, they allocate $2 million for crisis pregnancy centers, and when I talked to some of the Republicans who were behind that push for that money, they basically said, we always talk about, we got to get rid of abortion and restrict it, but we never allocate any money to actually help women who are struggling with this difficult decision. And so, they sort of justified it by basically saying this money will go to crisis pregnancy centers, and those crisis pregnancy centers can help buy maternity clothes or prenatal vitamins or help these women see doctors.
So, yeah. I mean, I want to interrupt here just to be clear about the difference between Willow Pregnancy and the folks that I met in Oklahoma City and the average crisis pregnancy center. The average crisis pregnancy center is a storefront operation that will give women an ultrasound and a little onesie for the baby that they might have. And they'll also hand out for new moms some diapers often. Which is a really serious thing. Diapers are the single biggest cost that changes when you have a baby, $80 to $100 a month to keep your baby in diapers. That's unaffordable for poor women, right? But what crisis pregnancy centers don't do is give a woman a place to live, a place to get sober, a 12-step program, vocational training, a roof above her head for when she has that baby. That's what makes Willow Pregnancy in Oklahoma City unique. It is really expensive. They can take 5 women at a time. That's 5 babies that they save if you sort of understand how they're seeing the world. But it's going to take a whole lot more Willow pregnancies out there. And the idea that just throwing money at CPCs will create meaningful alternatives to abortion is a fantasy. Right? It's going to take serious money to really give women alternatives that allow them to have babies they want to have.
Yeah.
Do you ever see a point in time where abortion is not necessarily a political issue anymore? And I say that thinking back, a decade or 2 decades ago, gay marriage was a very hot button issue. And now it's really fallen to the wayside. And part of that is because of Supreme Court decision. And so I'm curious, if the court does take up Roe v. Wade again and they rule on that, will people stop talking about abortion?
I don't think it's likely in my lifetime here, but I have been studying places where abortion is just a completely settled issue, and I know that it's possible. In France, in Israel, in countries that have the lowest abortion rates in the world, it's a non-issue, and it's largely a non-issue because those are countries that really want their babies. And so what they do is they set up very meaningful supports for folks who get pregnant and are, not necessarily in a stable place in their lives and so are considering abortion. And you've got child allowances, and you've got tax breaks, and you've got subsidized daycare and parental leave policies. You've got, the daycare is in your neighborhood. That's what it looks like in the countries that have the lowest abortion rates in the world and where it's just not controversial. We may get there, but it's really hard to see down and around the bend from where we are right now.
It's an interesting question because Carmen, you and I are not terribly too different in age, a little bit different, but growing up, the big culture wars for us was gay marriage and abortion, and one of those has kind of shifted a lot, the other hasn't. And what makes abortion issues such a fascinating topic is there's a lot of reasons, but this is an issue that people are very divided on. That doesn't seem to be changing. And I think it's also a lot more complex when you get beyond just the partisan politics that happen at a state capitol or in Congress. People come to their beliefs on abortion through a variety of different ways. A lot of it is religious, especially if you're in a really deeply religious part of the country like we are. But, it's not always just a partisan issue for everyone, but it often gets played up as that way. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I had a chance to read
My
this book
pleasure.
several months ago and found it really fascinating. I was glad that we could bring you on to talk about it. Just in the minute we have left with you here, just what's the most fascinating aspect of this that you're going to be watching for? I mean, how much are you paying close attention to the national debate, the Supreme Court debate? Are there any other states that you're particularly fascinated by right now moving forward on this issue?
So it's odd because I'm a law professor and I follow the politics of abortion, but the piece that I'm most excited to watch over the coming decade or so is how good people on both sides show up. Because I think that it's only going to intensify the battle over abortion. And I've met good people on both sides, and I've met cynical people on both sides. And I think that the piece I'm most hopeful about is that the good people will find themselves having to take different political positions, perhaps, than they've taken, having to show up in different ways and having to really forge common ground, because what they care about is the lives of the poor people who are just being ground up in our, in our political system and in our economy today. And abortion shows up in their lives in ways that I think people on both sides should be deeply concerned about. We owe them more.
Well, the book is Her Body, Our Laws. Michelle Oberman of the Santa Clara University School of Law. Thank you so much for your time. We enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back for more Political State. Carmen and I will talk about the legislative session that just wrapped up at the state capitol. You're listening to Political State from the Oklahoman. We'll be back in just a moment. All right, welcome back to the Political State podcast from the Oklahoman. Ben Felder here alongside Carmen Foreman. And Carmen, interesting conversation with Michelle about abortion, which is just, obviously one of the biggest hot button political issues. But still, I was kind of surprised that we didn't see as much talk about it in the legislature this year. I mean, on one hand, we did. I mean, there were massive rallies. There was some demonstrations at the Capitol pushing forward the bill that would reclassify abortion as a homicide, but it just seemed like legislative leaders really weren't interested in really taking this issue forward in the way that we've seen in some other states. And given Oklahoma's history, that's just a little surprising that the legislature chose to sit this one out.
Yeah, I think, I'm not saying it's always going to be this way. I think next session could be different from this session, but I do think that the Oklahoma legislature seems to have recognized the position it's put the state in previous years. And part of that has to do with having a new governor elected. But I think there's some recognition on the legislature's part that to some extent their actions put Oklahoma on a national playing field. And this could be said about I wrote about the 4-day school weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And Senate Republicans were very, very in favor of doing away with the 4-day school weeks, and they passed legislation to sort of curb the 4-day school weeks because they say it makes the state look bad on a national level.
Yeah.
And some of the very heated rhetoric about abortion also catapults our state into the national level. And so we could be the same as Alabama right now. We could be in that same situation, but I think to some extent legislative leaders have moved away from some of these social issues because they want to stay away from the national platform.
Yeah, and I also think just in a year when we just came off an election year, you've got a new governor who, despite the fact that said, I will sign any anti-abortion legislation that crosses my desk, I imagine that's not something he wanted to get to in this first year. I mean, he had issues of the budget, wanting to get that, wrapped up. He had funding priorities that he campaigned on. Cultural issues become a distraction from the kind of nuts and bolts of politicking. Now, I think you're right. Next year may be a different story. It'll be year 2. We'll be in an election year. There may be a feeling that they can kind of spend some time on that. But when you just had thousands of teachers rally, walking out of their classrooms last year, you have people pointing to the fact that, rural hospitals are closing. I mean, there's some real issues, and I don't want to make light of abortion. For some people, that's a very real issue and a very important issue. But there are just, like I said, those nuts and bolts issues that the state has neglected for so long that it felt like that maybe the uniqueness of Oklahoma this year was that you had a legislature that said, listen, we really do need to address some of these other issues. But I don't think, I don't think we've seen our last of anti-abortion legislation.
Oh, agreed. And we did see some anti-abortion legislation. And the governor did sign that bill that had to do with medication-assisted abortions and
notifying women that it could be reversed, kind of based on some, iffy science on that front. So we did see some, and in some other states that would be a really big deal. Just given our history, it seemed like a low-key year on the abortion front, which, like I said, is just kind of a little surprising when you think about how the abortion debate is really ramped up this year in light of what other states are doing, the new Supreme Court, and just kind of what we might see moving forward. Well, that legislative session did come to an end this week. Officially, we still have another week, so the legislature could mobilize again if they wanted to try to override a veto. But they adjourned yesterday. Governor signed the budget today. I want to talk about that budget, something that you're writing about today. Man, the governor really got everything he wanted this year for the most part.
Yeah, he really did. And not even just in the budget. I mean, he basically kicked off the session, and him and the legislature agreed to the government accountability, the agency accountability bills. So he has more power over some of the state agencies. And then this budget, he got teacher pay raises, which he's been promising since the campaign trail. He socked away $200 million in savings, which is going to put our savings over $1 billion, which puts him halfway to his savings goal of $2 billion by the end of his first term. He got $19 million for the Quick Action Closing Fund, which most listeners probably aren't familiar with, but it's like an economic development tool that the state uses, and the governor can basically dole out money as he sees fit to try and bring businesses to the state. Even the governor's office more than doubled its own budget, which they say is basically a transparency measure, and they got $2 million to fix up the governor's mansion. When the money is good, it seemed like things turned out really well for Governor Stitt this year.
Yeah, and I think I remember when he announced his budget, his own budget proposal. We didn't see a huge amount of pushback from Republicans, and that's really what mattered because they control the House and the Senate. But that $200 million savings figure was one that I heard leaders saying, I don't know about that. It's hard to imagine that we have so many things that we want to fund that putting $200 million away into the rainy day fund seems not possible. In fact, if I remember right, I think the House, their proposal was like around $50 million or something along.
Yeah, I think they wanted closer to 10% of the surplus, not essentially 33% of the surplus.
But he got that, and a governor that won a pretty convincing, victory that seemed to really, do a decent job in this first session of capitalizing on the momentum that he got from last November.
Yeah, one of the Republican lawmakers in the Senate told me that it's basically the legislature recognizes how popular Governor Stitt is, and Stitt has more of a platform to speak to the public than lawmakers do, or he speaks to a wider berth of the public here in Oklahoma, and they recognize that the people like him, and so if they can do what the governor wants, then maybe the people will like them too.
Yeah, that's politics. One thing we didn't see get done was Medicaid expansion. Not that I didn't see this as too likely of a thing this year. There were some efforts, especially late, by some lawmakers to try to get some kind of version of Medicaid expansion, but even that didn't get through. Is this an issue that we're going to see taken back up again next year, and will that be too late? Are we going to see, already headed towards the 2020 ballot question?
Definitely plan on seeing it again next year. And Medicaid expansion is one of those issues that's so complicated. You really have to devote a lot of legislative time to it, and you have to have a very solid proposal that is going to pass a wide berth of Republicans that already don't want to necessarily expand Medicaid, or I guess how the governor referred to it this morning at his bill signing is he wants to put together an Oklahoma plan. And I think it's very likely that you'll see something like work requirements for Medicaid recipients, or training requirements. Could be like a requirement that some of these recipients have to pay a small portion of a premium to receive services. But the governor and legislative leaders have said they're going to work on it in the interim. The governor has said he wants to have a proposal out there by the fall. I once heard him say by August, and then today he said by October. So I think they're trying to get ahead of the Medicaid expansion ballot question. But I think there are Republicans in the legislature who recognize that if they tackle this next year, they may be too late, and the ballot measure may already be gaining steam.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we would be talking about it as much as we were this year if there wasn't the prospect of a ballot question, which is that effort is already underway.
And something that Representative Emily Virgin pointed out to me is that the legislature could do Medicaid expansion next year, and then the ballot question could still pass. So it may not be an either or situation. It may be a both situation.
Yeah, and you may be setting up. I mean, that'll be interesting because I think you're going to, if that scenario plays out, I think you would have a governor and Republican leaders who are, obviously going to be actively campaigning against it. I don't say they're going door to door campaigning against it, but they are going to be trying to, talk up their plan versus the ballot initiative plan. I wonder how, are Oklahomans going to think, well, you have Medicaid expansion light. Here on the ballot is full Medicaid expansion. If we're going to have Medicaid expansion, we might as well go all through. Or is there a Republican stake in to say, all right, we trust the Republican legislature's plan more than we do a full Medicaid expansion plan?
Right. But if, Virgin pointed out that if the Medicaid expansion light does pass the legislature, but it let's say it covers 90,000 uninsured Oklahomans, and then Medicaid expansion on the ballot covers 100,000 Oklahomans, the ballot measure could still pass, and then more coverage. I wouldn't even know what it would do to the Republican plan at that point. It's hypothetical situation.
And I don't think, there's not much the legislature could do about getting a ballot question off, even if they wrote into the law that says, like, if we pass our plan, that trumps the Medicaid expansion plan. I mean, I think you're setting yourself up for a very messy fight.
Yeah, that seems like it would go to the courts, and then the courts would say, well, the people directly voted on this ballot question, so it seems like the will of the people would surpass the will of the legislature, but I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to see. So, a budget's done, legislative session is done. As you've reported, the session will officially end next Friday. That gives lawmakers a chance to quickly mobilize if they want to override a veto from the governor. Is there any bills that you're particularly following closely to see if the governor does veto, to see what the legislature does? Or
it seems unlikely that they'll come back to try and override any of the governor's vetoes. There was one bill that I was curious about if they would try to override the veto, because there was a Republican-sponsored bill that would have changed the requirements for HIV and AIDS education in schools, and it got bipartisan support through both houses, and then the governor vetoed it. But it sounds like the bill's sponsor is not really interested in picking a fight this year, so maybe he'll try it again next year, rewrite some of the language, see how it goes.
Yeah. So a little bit of a calm after the session, I suppose, and we'll get into the interim session in the fall. Some other issues will be brought up in some meetings. And then, man, we're headed into an election year now. I mean, it's really, when the session ends this year, it really, I don't know that it officially kicks off the 2020 election season, but it kind of does, because every decision moving forward, I think for many lawmakers, that election year is going to be how they view things.
Yes, absolutely.
A vote last week, I'm sure there are some lawmakers that are thinking about their re-election prospects when they're casting their vote. But it's a lot easier. It was easier last week to say 2020 is a long ways away. There's a whole other session between now and then. But not anymore. And a lot of these races are going to be getting underway this summer. In challenging, competitive races, this summer is when a lot of those races are going to get kicked off.
Right. And I will point out that there were rumblings in the Capitol that there could be a special session on Medicaid expansion. And so I am curious how, coming up with a Medicaid expansion plan or an Oklahoma plan, whatever you want to call it, how that is going to dovetail with an election year where a lot of these Republican lawmakers have to get reelected, and they might not be reelected if they vote for Medicaid expansion.
Yeah. Well, we saw a lot of lawmakers not run for re-election last year. This wasn't quite the extreme session that we saw in 2018, so maybe we'll see a few more incumbents come back. But who knows? Maybe we'll see another wave of lawmakers decide to retire early. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Political State Podcast. Carmen, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we'll continue to follow the official last week of session, which is next week, to see if there is any drama. Not expecting there to be too much. But we'll be keeping tabs. So with the Oklahoman, with Carmen, I'm Ben Felder. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you for another episode of Political State next week.